So I was asked by my old work to do a presentation about Dungeons and Dragons. I mean, I say asked, I sort of lobbied for it, decided I wanted to do it. So it was a great success. When I say it was a great success, no one got angry and punched me in the face. It did sort of develop into me running my regular game. So, it's kind of a success. And I know, like, they actually did film some of those presentations, but they didn't film mine. So I thought, well, I've done all that research, I might as well immortalise it somewhere. Did actually write it up as a blog, but I think no one reads blogs anymore. Well, no one reads mine anyway. So I did a show of hands, and it did turn out most people who were at the presentation had actually played a role-playing game at one point or another, and everyone who hadn't, they played computer role-playing games. So, I did have a section where I explained it, for the muggles. But I think if you're watching this, you probably know you don't need me to explain it to you, but I'm going to explain it anyway, but in a very, very brief way. So it's a role-playing game, mostly takes place in the imagination of the players. Here's some typical players.
Congratulations, Daniel. You just finished your first Dungeons & Dragons campaign.
Woo! All right.
And this is the sort of thing they're imagining themselves as.
Let them come.
So in D&D and other role-playing games, people choose a character class, which is kind of like your job. They can be ranger, wizard, fighter, any sort of archetypal character types of that genre. Dungeon Master kind of runs the game. He is the referee. He plays all the other characters that aren't played by the players. He controls the world. He sort of has a basic plot that he puts them through. And you roll dice to determine actions. So the game mostly takes place in the imagination of the players, but you can use accessories, you can use miniatures to represent your characters. It's particularly in combat and tactical situations. These are some miniatures that I painted back when I was a teenager. This is what I was doing when everyone else was listening to the Happy Mondays and getting off with girls. One of the questions you get asked very regularly by people who aren't necessarily into that whole genre are, do you have to dress up? No, of course you don't have to dress up, but it's worth noting that you don't have to not dress up either. So Dungeons and Dragons is set in a fantasy world, as the name might suggest. Of course, there are other role-playing games and there are other genres of role-playing games. But Dungeons & Dragons was the first, and it's by far the most popular, and has always been the most popular. And I think a lot of people use Dungeons & Dragons just as a sort of generic term for a role-playing game. It basically came out of the wargaming scene of the early 1970s and 1960s. Now, all I know about the kind of development of the game I've learned from books, and most of the information, most of the research I did for this presentation I got from a couple of different books. I definitely recommend a book called Of Dice and Men, not just for the title, it was a great title, written by David M. Ewalt. And there's also a series of books called Designers and Dragons by Shannon Appleseed, which is a kind of very authoritative history of the entire industry, not just D&D and TSR, but all the other games companies, and that's really, really worth reading. Really, really comprehensive. There's one called Playing at the World by John Peterson, and that's a really well-researched, almost like a textbook. It's not light reading, I mean it's gigantic. So broadly speaking, there was a wargamer by the name of Dave Arneson who hit upon the idea of giving the players in his wargaming group a single character to control rather than an army. You know, these guys would get together and they'd run Napoleonic combat simulations, you know, big tables, always using metal miniatures. But Dave decided to throw in some fantasy elements and, again, you know, just give his players just one character rather than an army. And rather than fighting, you know, outside a castle, he took them underground, underneath the castle, and sent them through, you know, an underground labyrinth rather than the open battlefield. And obviously threw magic and fantastical creatures in there. It was Gary Gygax who took Dave Arneson's idea and really codified everything. He was a Wisconsin gamer who was very, very interested in medieval fantasy. He'd written his own rules, his own supplements for fantasy battles on top of the sort of medieval framework. So he really took this idea and he really ran with it, and he pretty much wrote the first edition of Dungeons and Dragons. So their declared influences included Edgar Rice Burroughs' John Carter of Mars, Robert E. Howard's Conan. There's sort of a lot of the kind of pulp adventure from the 30s and 40s. They also liked Fritz Lieber's fantasy Lankmar stories based around the city of Lankmar and the two characters Fafhrd and the Grey Mouse. So these, like Conan, were these pulp adventures, but they're much more sort of swashbuckling and had a bit more of a sense of humour. You know, in the 1960s, Michael Moorcock wrote these Eternal Champion stories, which had his most famous character was Elric. Oh, where's my Elric movie? He also wrote Corum and Hawkmoon and Ericos. And they were, again, influenced by Conan, but they were much more sort of psychedelic, really sort of 60s influenced. And also a big influence was Jack Vance. People always point to Jack Vance as the kind of originator of the magic system in D&D. He wrote these very sort of whimsical fantasies set in the dying earth. He also wrote this, which I'm only including because of the title, and I'm immature. So that's all the sort of fantasy authors they were interested in. But I wonder if there's any authors you can think of that haven't been covered there. Someone's missing. I wonder who it could be. It's almost like there's an elephant in the room.
It's an elephant.
So Gary Gygax always claimed there was very little influence from Lord of the Rings on Dungeons and Dragons. Whereas it was a medieval fantasy, it was much more sort of rooted in that kind of Conan tradition. Having said that, it did include elves and dragons and wizards and all the things from Lord of the Rings. Dwarves, I mean, see, we have these things in folklore. Things like elves, dwarves, trolls, all could mean the same thing in various sort of folklore traditions. But when Tolkien came to write Lord of the Rings, he kind of codified all these things. So his dwarves were this sort of very Germanic idea of, you know, little guys with beards and axes who worked in mines. I mean, he was the first person to ever come up with that. Hi-ho, it's home from work we go. Okay, he was maybe not the first, but certainly in terms of fantasy, he popularised it. And his idea of elves worked its way into D&D. And it can't really be overstressed how, you know, how culturally significant Tolkien was, particularly in the 60s. Obviously, those books had been published in the 40s, but, you know, America got its paperback edition in the 1960s and really, really achieved cult status, particularly among the hippies. You know, it had this kind of bucolic pre-industrial utopia, really. and its brave, warm-hearted, weed-smoking heroes, it really struck a chord with the counterculture. Hippies were wearing Frodo Lives badges and Gandalf for President badges, and it really influenced a lot of the art and music of the time. And it's always been, the most culturally significant fantasy, pure fantasy, medieval fantasy. It really seeped into the culture. Students' dorm rooms had, posters of wizards and warriors, and it was that environment that Arneson and Gygax were creating this game. Gygax claims that he put in specific Tolkien created terms such as Hobbit and Ent and Nazgul and Balrog, purely because those books were popular, and it would get the game more attention, although he always said there wasn't enough action in those books for him. Now, of course, in that first edition of D&D, the Tolkien estate lawyers came knocking, and they wanted things like Ent and Nazgul removed from D&D, so they were duly replaced by things like Treant for Ent, and Wraith, the generic term Wraith instead of Nazgul. Balrog became Balor Demon, although they're exactly the same. They exactly look, they've got the whip and the fiery sword and stuff. D&D used orcs, which is a Tolkien created term. He always used it as it means the same as goblin in Tolkien, but in D&D they're different creatures, but there's not that much difference. I think orc just fell through the cracks, so that's the reason we've got orcs in a lot of different franchises now. They're in Warhammer, they were in Fighting Fantasy books, they were in that movie with Will Smith.